This now, Africa's world wars. That is how the two great conflicts on the continent involving the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its neighbor Rwanda have been described. The cost in human lives has been absolutely devastating. Millions have been killed in a fight that's partly over the control of resources in the mineral-rich part of the Great Lakes region. And if you go back all the way to 1994 and the genocide in Rwanda, while numerous armed groups have competed with central authorities for power and control of the potential fortune in the vast nation next door, the DRC. It costs us, get this, an estimated $100 million to be there. Imagine how much better that money could be used right here at home. So why are we there in the first place? We've invited Senior Research Fellow at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Stephanie Wolters, to help us wade through all of this. Stephanie, a very good morning to you and welcome to our program.
Good morning, Bongani.
The latest fighting has broken out in the eastern part of the DRC in Goma. This is a city of at least 1 million people. We've seen this kind of thing before. Wasn't it in 2012 when the M23 rebels advanced on that city and later withdrew? What's brought the latest tensions to the fore?
Well, actually, this conflict that has now led to the taking of Goma over the last few days has been going on since 2021. So the M23, you're correct. We first got to know them in the crisis around 2012 and 2013, where South Africa also intervened. But this new crisis, which is now in its fourth year, was essentially triggered by a number of different things: regional rivalries, interests that Rwanda had in the eastern DRC, a new dispute between Kinshasa and Kigali. And so this has been going on for 4 years. It's certainly culminated now in this acute crisis of Goma being taken. It's symbolic. It's the capital of the province. And as you say, it's a city of about 1 million people. But it's important to understand that this has been on the radar of the international community and of African peace and security instances like SADC and the East African community since 2021. And the M23 has been taking increasing amounts of territory in North Kivu for those last 4 years.
All right. As I understand it, the genesis of all of this goes all the way back to the genocide because, of course, the M23 are led by ethnic Tutsis who say they needed to take up arms to protect their rights as a minority in the eastern DRC following, I suppose, the escape, if you will, of many of those who would have been accused of participating in the genocide.
Look, Rwanda's interests in the eastern DRC have evolved significantly since 1994. You're right that in the initial stages of Rwanda's involvement in the eastern DRC, it was about tracking down the Interahamwe. That is something that sparked the war that overthrew Mobutu in 1997, and it's also something that then subsequently sparked what you've described as Africa's World War. Since then, Rwanda's interests have evolved. The M23 does pretend to be a group that represents Tutsi and Banyamulenge interests. It doesn't actually really do that. It's not considered representative of that community. Many members of that community, in fact, feel that these Rwandan-backed proxy groups put them at greater risk because they are greatly resented by the Congolese population. Rwanda has now quite different interests, and it is essentially pursuing those interests using this Congolese proxy group as a shield or as its own identity. But one of the things that Rwanda does want to do, and which it has been doing, is essentially occupy eastern DRC for a variety of different reasons that it doesn't put forward. And it's important to note that Rwanda does not acknowledge that it's supporting the M23.
Yeah, I was about to go there and say they've consistently denied supporting them, but the United Nations has accused Rwanda of providing weapons, logistical support, and even ultimately commanding the rebels.
Yes, absolutely. I think, it's not really even a matter of accusation anymore. We have extensive evidence of this that has been building up. There's a UN panel of experts, which is very well placed to be looking into these kinds of things. The U.S. has said it. The Belgians have said it. I mean, many international organizations and different countries are now, this has been a fact for some time. And in addition to the logistical and financial support, and also the command and control coming from Rwanda, we have an estimated 4,000 Rwandan defense forces, Rwandan soldiers in eastern DRC who are fighting with the M23. So this is very much a regional army.
All right. Explain then who the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda are. Are they the genocidal militia Rwanda says they are?
Well, look, they are. I mean, the FDLR is the political name for the former Interahamwe. Absolutely. Now, this is a group which has been substantially diminished over the last 25 years. Attrition, the arrest of a number of their key leaders, the return to Rwanda, the voluntary return of a number of their leaders and also of their combatants, targeted military operations led by the Congolese army in conjunction with the UN peacekeeping force. There were times also when the Congolese government allowed Rwanda into the DRC to come and defeat this group. So today they are not a force that represents a threat to Rwanda. It's important to understand that. And it's important to look at the fact that in the last 20 years, there's been no attack by the FDLR on Rwanda. The FDLR are much more a threat to the local communities where they are very much embedded, but they are very much a spent force. Today, the estimates are that they perhaps have between 1,000 and 1,500 combatants left.
So why are we there?
Well, look, South Africa has international, I guess, responsibilities, and it has international ambitions as well. I mean, South Africa is a player in peacekeeping on the continent, both bilaterally and also multilaterally through organizations like SADC. And it has a very, very long history in the Eastern DRC. It has participated in the UN peacekeeping force since the 2000s. That force, that contingent, then became part of the Force Intervention Brigade, which was in fact created in response to the 2012 M23 crisis. And then on top of that, in this latest crisis, SADC has decided to come to the assistance of one of its member states, which is the DRC, and it has put forward this additional force called SAMI-DRC. So South Africa has played a role there for a long time, militarily in the last 2 decades, but also politically. And it clearly feels that it has a continued obligation, responsibility, and interest in being in the Eastern DRC and helping the Congolese government.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. It costs us, $100 million to participate in this. It's thousands of kilometers away from our shores. Are we even up to the task?
Yeah, I think that they're important questions. I mean, you're right that the investment is huge at a time when, of course, South Africans feel that there are more important domestic needs that should be attended to. Then there's the concerns about whether or not the SANDF is in a position really to take this on. Does it have the resources, the training, the support it needs from the SANDF? Those are all very valid questions. The SAMI-DRC force is estimated to cost $500 million a year. SADC has renewed the mandate until the end of 2025. Some of that money is coming from the Congolese government. It's also coming from some of the other SADC states. But there are very, very important concerns about the resources. I think also the question is a military solution really the right one for this conflict? I think absolutely not. There has to be a political solution. So can SAMI-DRC really contribute to resolving this in any substantial way? And I think, unfortunately, over the last few days, with what we've seen happening with the SANDF and the SAMI-DRC, we've seen that they're not able to push back against the M23, which again is a very, very strong army supported by Rwanda. And so the question is this really a good investment for any of these countries, and is it changing things on the ground?
What have you heard? Because we're expecting the DRC president, Felix Tshisekedi, to address his nation later today. We know some of his forces have surrendered to the M23 militants. Would that then include some of the troops that presumably would have been fighting with DRC soldiers?
No, I don't think we've seen the surrender of SANDF soldiers or other members of the SAMI-DRC of Tanzania and Malawi. My understanding is that SAMI-DRC troops have retreated to Sake, which is where the military force is headquartered. They are, to some extent, stuck there because M23 has taken the airport in Goma. There is ongoing fighting for the full control of that city. But as far as I understand, SAMI-DRC is not on that front line at the moment.
How much does this have its roots in the colonial partitioning I mean, Goma, for instance, is much closer in distance, one might even argue ethnically, to Kigali. Could that be the original sin?
Look, I really don't think so. This really isn't about that. This is about the political dynamics in the Great Lakes, about the different conflicts we've seen in Rwanda, but also Burundi and Uganda, which have increasingly played themselves out in Eastern DRC. This isn't really about the border running through communities that should be united. This is about the political, the security, and the economic interests of the countries in that region, which have evolved over the last 30, 40 years.
So in that context, then, are our troops cannon fodder? I'm reminded of Bangui in Central African Republic.
Yes, I wouldn't go so far as to say cannon fodder. I think that also when we have to remember that when SAMI DRC deployed, which was in 2023, and the decision was made in 2023, there was a slightly different dynamic. There were ongoing talks between Kinshasa and Kigali. There was a roadmap for a ceasefire, and the idea was that SAMI DRC would help push back against some of the positions that M23 was in, but also that it would then help oversee a ceasefire and monitor that ceasefire. The military situation has evolved substantially since then. The political talks have hit a wall. And so SAMI DRC today is really stuck in a situation where the military aspect of this conflict has become the front and center, and where many of the other mitigating processes are no longer supporting them. So it's a very difficult situation.
What's your advice? Withdraw or send reinforcements?
That's a very difficult question. I think that right now we really need the political processes to kick in. We've got a lot of reactions from the international community. The UN Security Council has had an emergency session. The AUPSC is having an emergency session. And we think that there is an announced session by the East African community, of which the DRC and Rwanda are members, tomorrow. So a lot of the political urgency is very much on the table. The new Trump administration has got involved. There's been a lot of pressure. I think it's time for Rwanda to be told that this has to end. That's certainly a key element of this. And if those political processes can kick in and we can get to a ceasefire, then SAMI DRC definitely has a role to play there.
Final question. In all of this, how many lives have been lost? And is there any end in sight?
Well, it's just extensive. I mean, it's shocking. We obviously have the lives that were lost during the 1998-2003 conflict, but more recently, we have over close to 2 million people displaced since the start of this conflict, and these are people who've been living in a zone of constant conflict for decades. They're IDPs over and over and over again. I mean, the destruction of the economic fabric of Eastern DRC, many civilian casualties, kids not going to school, hospitals overrun. It's just unbelievable. And since just the beginning of this year, we have 400,000 people being displaced since January 1, 200,000 kids being displaced since January 1. It's just the humanitarian crisis is unimaginable. And I think, again, it's important to remember that this crisis and this civilian suffering is taking place on the Congolese side of the border, not on the Rwandan side of the border. So DRC is bearing the consequences of this much more than anyone else in the region.
Stephanie Wolters, Director of Okapi Consulting, Senior Research Fellow at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Appreciate your time.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.